Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm excited to welcome you here today to the Jefferson Wells Digital Event Series on Fcpa and Global Anti-Corruption Programs. We have a wonderful presentation for you, and I'm pleased to introduce our presenter. But before we get started with today's discussion, we have a few quick housekeeping items to cover. In order to ensure your best audio and visual quality, please listen through your computer by turning on your speakers after you log into the event. During your viewing experience today, please feel free to adjust your viewing by clicking on the four-dot symbol in the upper right-hand corner. This webinar also qualifies for 1 CPE credit. You must participate for 50 minutes of the webinar in order to be eligible for credit, and each participant must be logged in to track your participation for 50 minutes. There will also be a series of polling questions asked throughout today's session. Please take a moment to answer the polls when they are launched on your screen. Each polling question will remain open for 60 seconds. CPE certificates will be emailed to all attendees next week. Next, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them by clicking on the question mark icon to open the Q&A window. If we run out of time to answer questions, we will certainly be answering them via email after the presentation is closed. So to begin, I'd like to kick things off by welcoming our presenter for this session, Ed Williams. Ed?
Hey, good morning, Salima, and thank you. Good morning and afternoon to everyone else joining us. I'm coming to you from Denver today. So I see East Coast, good afternoon, West Coast, good morning. Looking forward to this today. We'll be talking about Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and some other global corruption trends and best practices and things that we're seeing working with our clients who have international operations and do things around the international space, where things like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the things like global corruption risks are prevalent to them, and some of that. So we'll get into that. But first, as always, in a topic like this, we do need to make a disclaimer that the information we're providing today is for entertainment purposes only. I'm not a lawyer. Jefferson Wells is not a law firm. So none of the information here should be construed as legal advice. If you need any legal guidance, we definitely recommend reaching out to your own legal internal counsel or outside counsel for specific guidance and advice around, legislative or regulatory matters like we're going to talk about today. So with that behind us, the agenda for today, we're going to kind of cover in the next 50 minutes here. We're going to touch on a wide variety of elements related to global corruption, anti-corruption efforts, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, what we're seeing globally, what's changing in recent years with other countries, what they're doing with regulations and legislation similar to the FCPA. We'll switch gears a little bit and we'll talk about what should we be doing as companies, as internal audit or financial leaders or compliance leaders or legal departments. We'll get into what are the key elements of a good global anti-corruption program, and hopefully give you some real tangible information, some things that you can take back to your organizations and hopefully find useful. And then at the end, we'll share some of my favorite resources around these topics. So if you're doing risk assessments or you're doing due diligence, or you're helping your organization try to implement the Global Anti-Corruption Program, we'll point you in the direction of some good resources. A little bit about myself. Why am I somewhat qualified to talk with you today about this? I've been with Jefferson Wells now for 20 years. I've been in the internal audit and compliance space for about 26 years. And fortunately for me, in the last 10 to 12 years, I've had a tremendous opportunity to work with some organizations in this space, consulting organizations on how to establish or how to improve their compliance programs, helping organizations set up their compliance and their anti-corruption programs. I had the honor of serving as a head of internal audit for two public companies who one, unfortunately, because of some issues and some violations of the FCPA, found themselves in trouble. And as a result, paid some hefty fines and were required to beef up their internal practices, implement a global corruption program, and do it under the watch of a compliance monitor. If you don't know what a compliance monitor is, it's kind of like a big corporate babysitter that the government sends your way to watch you for 3 or 5 years as you try to rebound from big violations like FCPA or corruption or others. And then another organization where I also had the opportunity to serve as the head of internal audit was a large manufacturing company who grew globally over about 10 years, manufacturing plants in about 20 countries. And through that expansion, helped them build and implement a global anti-corruption program, implementing the program, designing training, doing risk assessments, and doing auditing, location audits, country audits, and distributor audits. All right, moving right along. Polling question number 1. And as Salima mentioned, we'll have 3 polling questions today. Pretty important. Watch for these and make sure you answer all 3 of them to get your CPE credits.
Excellent. Thank you, Ed. So let's start off with polling question number 1. Which is most accurate regarding the FCPA Global Anti-Corruption Program at your company? Do you have a very formalized and mature GACP? Do you have most elements of a GACP, but they are decentralized and informal? Do you have a basic GACP element? Or FCPA and other global anti-corruption laws and regulations are not applicable or relevant to my organization? Please go ahead and take a moment here to vote.
Thanks, Salima. And we'll give it a little bit of time here for responses to come in, and we'll take a look at the responses, kind of see what our audience makeup today is. I imagine, my guess is that we're going to see kind of a wide swath of answers here.
Excellent. So we've got about 95% voted here so far. So we'll just give it a few more seconds and we'll gather these answers for you.
Great.
All right. So here are our results.
All right. Look at that. Kind of exactly what I thought. Organizations are definitely in different places related to all of this, all the way from, hey, it's just not applicable to me, to, hey, we've got a very formalized and mature program. So good information kind of helps me know a little bit about the audience we have on today. And even for those of you where you feel like this is not relevant, I think some of the things I talk about today will make you realize that some of this is actually very relevant. Maybe not the FCPA specifically, but some of the other corruption risks that exist out there in our businesses today. All right, moving right along. We'll talk a little bit about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I'm guessing most folks on here, and I'm assuming most of you have a basic understanding of what this is. So this is not going to be a deep dive into the FCPA itself. The FCPA was enacted in 1977. So 43 years ago, this law was enacted, and it's kind of amazing that when I quickly did the math, I thought, my goodness, 43 years this thing has been in place. And it's been 43 years of debate, litigation, investigation around this, and it continues today. There's still a lot of debate and regulatory legislation trying to interpret the FCPA. It was enacted way back in the 70s by the U.S. government, In an effort to kind of curb a trend in international corruption and bribery that was happening, and the US government felt like we needed legislation like this to kind of help level the playing field and increase investor confidence in the U.S. Businesses. Um, that's been debated for 43 years whether or not it did level the playing field or did it put us at a disadvantage. In the early days, definitely put the U.S. at a disadvantage because a lot of other countries did not have similar rules. Things like bribery and accurate books and records, things like that weren't necessarily required by other countries. It was required of a US company going into Europe or going into Asia or going into South America and trying to compete. And a lot of the debate early on was that US companies had one hand tied behind their back because they couldn't engage in some of these same practices that local companies could. So to boil it down, there's the FCPA is very simple. And I say that sarcastically. There's the anti-bribery provision and there's the books and records provision. The anti-bribery provision simply says US companies cannot bribe government officials in order to win work in that country. What is a government official? What is a bribe? Again, 43 years we've been interpreting and debating exactly what that is. And over the years, the interpretations and guidance have come out almost regularly, helping companies interpret what is okay, what is not okay. The other element of the FCPA is the accurate books and records provision. Think about this like Sarbanes-Oxley. This says that you have to have accurate financial records that represent your transactions, and you should have good internal controls. It's kind of the 1977 very early version of SOX that didn't quite have some of the reach and some of the meat that SOX has today, but it's very similar. You have to keep good records, and if you commit bribes, you need to record them as bribes. So it's kind of an ironic twist there. So you'll see some organizations are found in violation of one or the other of these provisions, or sometimes both. Penalties range. I mean, obviously, it's everyone's aware that if you violate some of the laws like this, there's going to be financial penalties, and there definitely are very large financial penalties. Fines that are levied on the companies for violations, and disgorgement. Disgorgement is the government determines how much money and profit you made from the illegal activity, and they take that profit and that money back. So it's a little bit different than a fine. Reputational hit on reputation is another cost of violating the FCPA or other laws. Sanctions lists, if you violate the rules, you get potentially can be put on sanctions lists, which then prohibit you from maybe engaging in government contracts or doing business with other companies, maybe as vendors or suppliers or things like that. And as I mentioned earlier, the compliance monitor. Oftentimes, organizations that find themselves in violation and guilty of violations are assigned a compliance monitor. And for typically it's 3 to 5 years where you have to have this babysitter check in on you periodically to make sure you're doing all the things you promised the government you were going to do in order to clean your house a little bit. So it's more than just financial penalties. There's a lot of other penalties that come into play for this. The other thing that's been highly debated and contested over the years is the word officials, foreign officials, and who exactly is a foreign official. And that varies around the world. When you think about the United States, things like our hospitals, our telecommunications companies, our infrastructure, engineering companies, typically not government entities. But when you get into other regions of the world, it's very common for hospitals to be run by the government. That makes a doctor in a hospital a government official, where in the U.S. a doctor would not be considered a government official. Or telecommunications companies are often run by governments. So if there is improper activity between a company and heads of telecommunications companies, they can be government officials. So again, it's one of the highly contested and debated things over the years is exactly what is a government official. Real quickly, in the US, the two agencies that have authority and jurisdiction are the Department of Justice and the SEC. More on the criminal liability side is the Department of Justice. More on the civil side with filers, public company filers with the SEC fall under their jurisdiction. They collaborate very closely. Oftentimes, sanctions and fines that come from both of these entities. You'll see in a minute when we talk, there'll often be a DOJ fine levied and an SEC fine or disgorgement levied. Both of these organizations or these groups have, in the last 10 to 15 years, really invested heavily in people, resources, technology, and collaboration with other foreign governments. And like anything else, it kind of ebbs and flows a little bit with the US federal administration, who's in office. Are we heavy regulatory and pushing things like regulations, or do we back off regulatory funding, things like that? That definitely play a part like this. 4 years ago, when Donald Trump was elected president, there was a lot of worry that the FCPA might be a target, and that potentially it could be unwound and drawn back a little bit. Fortunately, that never really happened. They, in recent times, regardless of the administration, they see the value in making sure that around the world we're engaging in behavior that's legal and beneficial to everybody. The reach of the FCPA is very interesting. It is an extremely global reach. Companies all around the world are subject to this US law. The scope of the law is very narrow. Again, going back to those 2 points, there's only 2 things that violate this law. It's a bribery of foreign officials to win work, or not keeping accurate books and records and controls. That's it. Theft, collusion, money laundering, these are all illegal under other legislation, other laws, but they don't come into play for the FCPA. So that's why today's topic is we're going to spend a little time here on FCPA, but we're definitely going to broaden this a bit. And that's why I like to call these things FCPA and global anti-corruption programs. So, any US company, any company based in the US with a physical footprint in the US is, of course, under its jurisdiction. But any other company around the world who does business in the US, has a subsidiary in the US, uses the US banking system, is part of the US stock exchanges, uses the US mail. Any of these entities can be brought under the jurisdiction of the FCPA. And it'll be interesting when we talk a minute here about the top 10 settlements in recent years. There's only 3 of the top 10 that are even US companies. All of the others are foreign-based entities, and some of them with very, very thin ties to the US, but yet enough of a tie to bring them under the jurisdiction of this law. Another really contested and debated and interpreted topic of the FCPA is what 43 years ago they called facilitation or grease payments. And the word grease payments is actually in the law. And many have been fighting for years to get that removed, because just the connotation of a grease payment, hey, how could a grease payment be okay? Just doesn't even sound right or sound legit. But it is facilitation payments and affirmative defenses. There are a couple scenarios where when you're making payments to government officials, it is okay. There's a lot of interpretation, and it's very much on a case by case basis. But basically, routine government actions, um, anything that's formally legal and written as okay in a local country helps kind of interpret and define this. And then there's the reasonable and bona fide expenditure test that comes into play. Um, but what you'll see today in most companies, probably 9 out of 10 companies who write policies around their international business, they actually call out facilitation payments as not acceptable under company policy. They don't even want to cross that line or push the line. So companies are playing it very conservative and making any kind of payments like these, even if legal under the law. Company conservatism is saying, hey, we don't even want to engage in that just to be safe. Quick look here at the top 10 FCA settlements, FCPA settlements of all time. Top of the list happened just this year. Goldman Sachs, bribery, committed bribes, had poor financial records, had poor internal controls. They used third parties to fund the monies, and they were found to have paid $1.6 billion in bribes, and they funneled them to win government contracts in Malaysia. The other one, KBR Halliburton, also U.S. And actually, there's one other one. I just don't have the Uk Ziff. Number 9 was a U.S. Hedge fund or capital management company that was committing bribes in South Africa or South America. They changed their name. None of these other companies actually changed their name as a result of the issues, but Uk Ziff did. Ericsson, slush funds were set up. Slush funds were set up to have access to money to pay government officials, and then they paid government officials through sham contractors, sham lobbyists, and things like that. And if you go through these, there's not a lot of difference between what these companies were found doing. Again, because they were FCPA settlements, they were either paying bribes to government officials, winning work, and not keeping accurate books and records. It's not uncommon for a company to, the DOJ, for example, maybe can't prove that these were bribes to win work to government officials, but what they can prove is that these payments were not accurately represented in the financials. Therefore, they can get them on the accurate books and records provision or lack of internal controls. But in most cases, you see that they get them on both violations of both provisions. If you're part of your company's internal audit function or compliance group, and you're responsible for training on the FCPA or doing audits, looking at these cases is a great way to see what others have done and got caught for. The SEC and the DOJ publish all of the details of all of these cases on their website. And I actually do some trainings where we really do deep dives into each of these scenarios, and learn from what others have done, learn what others tried to do, learn from how others got caught. So I encourage you to look into these if when you're setting up your programs or you're doing risk assessments or you're doing due diligence. This is a great insight into what others have done. Some others here, interesting ones. I won't go into too much detail here, but wanted to give you a few noteworthy ones if you wanted to do some research on these. The takeaway here is you've probably heard of every one of these companies, right? These are not obscure small companies that that you wouldn't be surprised committed these type of actions. But Anheuser-Busch, SAP, Johnson Controls, Walmart, all of these companies have been found to have violated these laws to varying degrees. And it kind of goes to show you, even some of these companies had very good policies, procedures, training. They had all the elements of a good anti-corruption program, but some rogue individuals or rogue subsidiaries, maybe a little bit removed from the the corporate culture of compliance, went off and did some things that they shouldn't have. So interesting cases there for a little research if you wanted to dig a little deeper into some of these. So switching gears a little bit, we've talked about the FCPA from that U.S. perspective, and what does the U.S. government say about these provisions and violations? What's nice is, before we dig into that, let me turn it over to Salim, and we'll hit our second polling question here.
Excellent. Thank you, Ed. As we go to polling question number 2 here, which law and its requirements were enacted first? The UK Bribery Act, US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or US Sarbanes-Oxley Act? And I apologize if I mispronounced that last one here for you. Excellent.
Thanks, Selena.
Got a little over half of the audience so far coming in.
All right, as those come in, we'll take a quick look at those results, and then we'll move on to kind of what's happening, what we're seeing in the out there in other countries. All right, so the vast majority of us did get that one correct. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. The UK Bribery Act is the newest of the bunch. That was not enacted until 2011. We'll talk briefly about that one because that was an interesting kind of comparison to the FCPA. So what are we seeing out there? What I mentioned earlier, what's really nice is a lot of countries are now finally getting on board with what the US started trying to do in the 70s, was really trying to level the playing field. While the FCPA is still, it's kind of the flagship legislation, it's the most known around the world. A lot of companies do interact with, global companies, international companies interact with the US, so they better know the FCPA. But what we're seeing a lot in the last 5 to 10 years is a whole bunch of good local legislation in other countries making bribery, gift giving, and corruption illegal locally. And so you put together, you combine what the FCPA says, what the UK Bribery Act says, and now these local laws, and it's really having a big impact. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, is kind of a global support organization. There's 37 members of that organization, and you can't just want to be a member as a country. You have to apply for membership, and you have to demonstrate that you are doing all the right things, that you recognize the risks associated with bribery and corruption. You're enacting laws to help prevent it, that you're actively enforcing your laws. And so these companies, you can see here, all of the 37 members of it. More interestingly, I believe, are when there's 4 members that you see not currently members of it. So Russia, China, Brazil, and India, 4 very large global economic powers, are not members of OECD. It's not that they don't do some good things. And every one of these countries has done some really good things in recent years. They just haven't done enough to qualify for membership and the benefit that comes with being part of OECD. Uh, Brazil, for example, is a good case study. Brazil put a lot of effort a few years ago into criminalizing corruption, things like money laundering, bid rigging, um, collusion, theft, embezzlement, you know. And then within about a year of all of that legislation going into effect, a large number of government officials were found to have been violating those rules and removed from office, put in prison. And so countries like Brazil and Russia are saying they're doing the right things, but they haven't yet caught up with the rest of the world in demonstrating that they really are doing all the right things. These are just a quick inventory of some of the legislation that exists. So you can see the UK Bribery Act, the Brazil Clean Companies Act, Canada, France, Russia. They're coming along, and these things are starting to get traction. They're starting to get some a bit of a stick to them, but they're coming along at different paces. Just a quick look at the UK Bribery Act. It was enacted in 2011, obviously by the United Kingdom. It really has it's all about bribery. And you can't bribe and you can't be bribed, which is kind of a unique twist on the way that the FCPA came at it. Any UK business, any UK citizen, or any person or company doing business with the UK is under the jurisdiction of this. You can get in trouble for bribing. You can be found in violation by accepting bribes, and you can be found in violation of not effectively preventing the bribes, which is kind of unique. The FCPA doesn't go there either. So companies have to actively be demonstrating that they are trying to prevent bribery. UK Act does not talk about government officials. It talks about associated persons. So where the FCPA is very limited, it has to be a government official to be an illegal bribe. But in the UK Bribery Act, they do not have to be government officials. They just have to be what they call associated persons. So what should we be doing? We'll switch gears a little bit. The US says we can't commit bribes and we must have accurate books and records for all of our transactions internationally. The UK Bribery Act is out there. Lots of local legislation that doesn't have to do with bribes, but has to do with money laundering, embezzlement, collusion, bid rigging, price fixing. These are all examples of corrupt behavior that the FCPA doesn't have any jurisdiction over. And the US has those very same laws here. So for some of those, you said that maybe the FCPA and global corruption topics today really don't apply to your company. This does, because a global anti-corruption program doesn't have to leave the US. It could be just helping make sure that your organization has the right program in place to prevent and detect corruption. And that could be embezzlement and bid rigging and theft within the borders of the US, within your contracts and in your construction projects and your vendors and your third parties. So what we're going to talk about from here on out is certainly applicable to international organizations, but it's also very applicable to every organization in the US who really does want to try to prevent and detect, corrupt behavior. So really what we should be doing, we should have an effective anti-corruption program. We can call it an FCPA program, but that's a little narrow. I like to call them global anti-corruption programs. And it can be as wide or as narrow scope as needs to be for your organization. So we'll quickly go through kind of each of these. This is intended to kind of be a bit of a roadmap and a to-do list, something tangible that if you're part of an organization that doesn't have these yet, this model can maybe help you get started. If you do have this program in place, and let's say you're part of internal audit, hey, part of your auditing and monitoring should periodically be looking at this program and make sure that the elements of this program are designed properly and operating properly. One of the things that I did recently for a large organization was they wanted a third party to come in and put a fresh set of eyes on this program. So we were fortunate enough to be picked to do that. And so we spent a bit of time looking at all these elements and offering up some recommendations on, hey, where things were looking really good, but then there were some areas where maybe things had slipped over the years and there were some real opportunities for improvement. So the first element of these programs, like any program like this, the tone at the top and sponsorship and leadership from your executive level, from your board of directors is critical. You know, the only way for a program of this nature to be effective is it has to start at the top, and the management and the board has to set the right example and the right tone. And if you do that, you have a much better chance of the rest of the organization following along. Risk assessment. You know, every organization is different. You have different structures. You have different geographic footprints. You have different products. You have different third parties. And so doing a customized risk assessment is important to know, well, where are my risks? What products are risky? What countries are risky? Which third parties are risky? And doing a good risk assessment is going to help you narrow that down so you can focus your training efforts. You can focus your auditing efforts on the risky areas, because most of us have some level of resource or budgetary constraints, and we can't cover everything all of the time. So these risk assessments really help us whittle that down a bit. From the risk assessment and from you know where your risks are, having really clearly defined policies, procedures, controls is a really important element of this. Codes of ethics, due diligence requirements, facilitation payment policies, internal controls over financial reporting, transparent financial reporting, a compliance program. You know, maybe it's broader than corruption. Maybe the corruption program is part of a broader compliance program, which is always a good idea, to have kind of compliance experts sort of managing the program. Training and communication. This is an important element of any compliance program. Any assessment of a compliance program will deem it ineffective if you haven't trained and communicated to your employees, your executive employees, your middle management employees, your frontline employees. And where a lot of companies fall short, they don't do a great job training and communicating with their third parties. So these are your third-party intermediaries, your vendors, your suppliers, your consultants. There's a lot of third parties, which we'll talk about here in a minute, that when it comes to training and communication, a lot of companies tend to miss the mark here in training them. We train our employees great, but we miss training our partners as well. So letting them know what the policies are and letting them know how to report potential issues. Having a whistleblower program to this day is still the most effective way that entities identify, or the government identifies, where wrongdoing is taking place. Sometimes we stumble across it in audits or kind of routine type work, but most of the time it's whistleblowers that still bring these cases to light. And with that, here we are at our third polling question. Salima, you take it away.
Yes, thank you, Ed. So for our third polling question here, which of the following should be considered a third-party intermediary from an FCPA perspective? A, wholesalers, B, brokers, C, consultants, D, distributors, E, resellers, or all of the above?
All right. Thanks, Salima. While everyone takes a moment to answer that. This will lead into a little deeper dive here in a moment about third parties. Third parties are really present about the most exposure that there is when it comes to these type of risks.
Excellent. So here we are with our results.
All right, look at that. We got almost 100% got this right. These are all defined as third-party intermediaries. These are all different kinds of entities who over time and through when you start reading through the cases and the case studies out there, every one of those listed there have contributed to a company somewhere around the world getting in trouble. All of the legislation that exists, the Fcpa, the UK Bribery Act, some of those other international laws I mentioned, the liability doesn't stop at the doors of your company. If you use distributors to get your products out around the world, if you use consultants, if you hire contractors, if you have registration agents, to help you get your product. If you're a medical device company, you need registration agents, or if you're a drug pharmaceutical, you need registration agents to help you get your products registered and okayed in foreign markets. Any of these agents are these third parties. If they commit the bribe, or they commit the money laundering, or they commit the embezzlement, it is going to come back to the parent company. That's where the liability is going to exist as well. Of course, the third parties are going to be brought into this, and there's going to be liability there. But the big U.S. company that hired the registration agent in, I don't know, Southeast Asia to get their medical device approved, they're going to be held liable under the FCPA, or even locally under some of that local jurisdiction. So doing due diligence of third parties is absolutely critical. We've got to do risk assessments. We have to understand who our third parties are. We have to understand what risks they present. We definitely have to communicate with them. We have to train them on our expectations of acceptable behavior. There needs to be clauses in the contracts that prohibit them from doing illegal behavior, clauses in the contracts that allow us to do audits, right to audit clauses. And we should be doing regular monitoring and auditing of these third parties to make sure that they are living up to our expectations. The last element here of an effective compliance program around corruption is doing auditing, monitoring, and responding to incidences. So we as internal auditors, I think most of us here today are in that kind of the internal audit or compliance space. We know this well. This is our job. There should be ongoing monitoring and auditing of these programs just to make sure that they're working properly, and periodically to be going and looking for incidences. So looking at high-risk transactions, licenses and permits, T&E expenses, consulting expenses, donations and contributions. You'll see in a minute. I'm going to walk us through a template of a typical audit program of a third party, and looking for the fraud, looking for the bogus payment, looking for the sham company. Really needs to be part of the audit when we're working with these third parties or other partners. So a little bit of a model here. If you don't already have them in place, this could serve as a bit of a foundation for you. Hey, if we're going to embark on doing some third-party audits, we're going to audit our consultants, we're going to audit our lobbyists, we're going to audit our distributors. I've done quite a bit. A Colorado-based global manufacturer of medical devices, uses a distributor model around the world. They use distributors to get their product into the market, into the hospitals. And so we have a regular routine of doing distributor audits around the world. We're currently figuring out how to do that in a pandemic. So we're on a bit of pause. But before the pandemic hit, we would do a combination of desk procedures here in the US. And then we'd also go out to the distributor locations. We would do interviews with management. We would do interviews with process and control owners. We would examine what their internal compliance programs are, what their activities are. We would look for good internal controls, make sure that they have a good environment for controls. And then we would do a lot of data analytics, a lot of digging down into transactions and making sure that there's no red flags. So we look at payments. We look at supporting documentation for those payments. We look at how payments are being recorded in the financials. If it's a consulting expense, was it really a consultant? Was there really consulting services? And is there documentation to support it? So we could spend an afternoon talking just about what the details of a full audit like this would look like. But this is just a bit of a foundation, a framework. If you're thinking about doing third-party audits, you could use that as a model. Drilling down just a little bit further, we look at their business model, we look at their compliance program, we look at their financial controls, and we look at financial transactions. And here you can just see some of the subcategories of the things that we look at. And you could do an audit like this with an existing third party, or this could be part of your due diligence before your company decides to partner with a third party. Internal audit can play a role in the due diligence phase. Do these audits pre-award before engaging a third party. Go through this exercise to determine if that's a third party that you want to be associated with. So kind of winding down here a bit, what a lot of folks have asked over the years is, wow, that's a lot to do. Is it really worth all the effort to implement that program, manage that program, monitor that program? And the answer is yes. And the first real significant example of that was Morgan Stanley several years ago now, got into big trouble with both the DOJ and the SEC. And what happened was, when the investigation was all done, there clearly was bribery and there clearly was violation of accurate books and records. But what the DOJ and SEC both said was, you know what? That Morgan Stanley was actually trying to do everything they could. They had good internal controls. They had training. They had continuous monitoring. They were doing due diligence. And despite all of that, unfortunately, a rogue subsidiary, and some people went off and did some very illegal things. So they decided not to bring some of the charges down against Morgan Stanley because they tried. They were doing everything they could. Now, they still got into a little bit of trouble, but it wasn't like the days past where huge fines and huge sanctions were levied. So the Morgan Stanley case kind of turned the corner in how effective compliance programs are being looked at by the government. And then in 2016 and 17, the Department of Justice rolled out what they called their pilot program. And this was really an incentive program. And it said, all right, companies, if you come to us and you proactively report yourself incidences that you've identified, the voluntary self-disclosure, they call it, if you cooperate thoroughly, and if you have had if we see that you have an effective compliance program, all that'll be taken into account. And so it was tested and piloted in 2016 and 17. It was an overwhelming success. So in 2017, it became permanent. And this thing exists now. And the fines can be much lower if companies come forth and self-disclose. So to close out here, I want to highlight some of my favorite resources. When you're trying to do research on risks related to FCPA and global corruption, if you're researching to do risk assessments and you want to know what the risks associated with doing business in certain countries, great resources here. You don't have to write all this down. Obviously, I'll make this available to you in the deck. Transparency International, that's kind of the flagship. They do their corruption perception index every year. It ranks all the countries of the world who's more risky from a bribery and corruption landscape. And so, if you're doing business in some of the Middle East countries or some South American countries, the risk is far higher than if you're doing business with Scandinavian countries, because you'll see in their rankings how all the countries of the world compare to one another. Trace International is a newer version of that. It's been around for several years now, but they also produce annually a global ranking of where corruption is more risky. The real go-to guide, the FCPA Resource Guide, published by the SEC and the DOJ, maybe about 10 years ago, and was recently updated just earlier this year, I believe it was, late last year, early this year. A few enhancements. It is the go-to guide. All things FCPA and corruption. If you're really looking for that detailed guidance from the government, straight from their mouth, that is the go-to. Make sure that is in your library. And some of these others are just great research and resource tools. And one last thing I'll point you to is this tool called Resist. It was put together by Transparency International and the World Economic Forum, a couple global think tanks, if you will. And then these 20 or so companies all contributed to this. And we don't have time today to do a deep dive into this, because this could be a whole day exercise. But what it does, it offers real life scenarios, real case scenarios. And I'm just going to show you one here of what you get out of this Resist tool. Here's an example of potential hidden compensation. Employees are working on contracts. Someone on the other side of the deal offers some compensation if you help them win the award. And what it does, it dissects these scenarios and says, all right, what could we have done to prevent this situation? What should we do in response to it? And I think there's maybe 30 or so case studies just like this one that are free, and they're made available. It's a public resource. You can go out there, you can download it, and it's a great way to take some of these conceptual ideas of what is a bribe or what is corruption, and you use these case studies to kind of really interpret that and break it down. And from that, you can do training. You can tailor your audits to look for these kind of risks and things like that. So I had a couple other examples here, but that's a great tool to look at. So hey, I'll end there. We got a few minutes left in case there are any questions that have come in. By all means, do take down my contact info. I love talking about this stuff. Give me a call, shoot me an email. I'd love to just brainstorm or share my experiences if you have any questions. And Salima, before we turn it over to the Q&A, a quick shout out. I think this is day 3 of our conference series. So thanks to everybody who's been involved the last couple days and attended our seminars. We have 2 more left today. If you're not registered, we've got a great cybersecurity session coming up in an hour or so. And then we have another one, data analytics for internal auditors. So if you haven't registered for those and those pique your interest, do register those. And that'll be the last 2 sessions of our 3-day conference. So Salima, if there's any questions, I'm happy to hit 1 or 2 before we cut everybody loose at the top of the hour.
Yes, thank you, Ed. And we do have We have a few questions that came in, but they're quite in length with our time we have left, but we've got one short one here. And the question reads, how often should most companies do the FCPA third-party risk assessment?
Yeah, I hate to be cliche, but it really depends. If you're a company and you've got an inventory of 300 third parties around the world, you probably can't do that annually, but you probably should do it annually with that many. I would suggest building just a right size framework for this risk assessment, depending on how many third parties you have, how risky it is, what countries you're in. But here's the nice thing: if you create a good risk assessment program or a risk assessment tool, updating it and refreshing it can happen pretty quickly. It's building the tool, designing it, but once it's built and you have your criteria for risk, they're really annually is the best way to do it, because you could pop in the new risk ratings, update your financial interests and all the elements of your risk assessment, pop in the new data, refresh it, and every year you can have a ranking, a prioritized ranking of really where are the risks with your third parties. So that would be my suggestion.
Excellent. Well, we will wrap it up there. Thank you, Ed, for such a great presentation. And as you mentioned, we've got 2 more sessions today to wrap up our digital event series for Jefferson Wells. We thank you, and we will see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.